work, Hidden in Plain Sight, Beyond the X-Files. And we'll be talking with Richard about that in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast to Coast. Beginning way back, early childhood, Richard Sauter experienced firsthand contact with a variety of strange, unusual paranormal phenomena that left him a bit puzzled, thoroughly persuaded that there's so much more to planet Earth and to human perception and consciousness than what the mainstream is trying to tell us or not tell us. Some of Richard's favorite research and reading interests are underwater bases and tunnels, electronic mind control, freedom technology, human prehistory, remote antiquity, the Kundalini energy, and alternative thought patterns. He's with us now. He's got his latest work out, Hidden in Plain Sight, Beyond the X-Files. Richard, I've been looking forward to this. How are you?
I'm fine, George. How are you?
Good, good. It's good to have you back, too.
Thank you.
This has been quite an undertaking, this latest work, and I wanted to get into the interest in some of these secret underground bases and how you began to investigate them. How did that happen for you?
Well, I've always had a kind of a nose for strange and anomalous information. So when I was a kid in my teens, one of my uncles knew about the construction of Mount Weather in the mid-Appalachians. Mm-hmm. This is about an hour's drive west of Washington, D.C., and I have a lot of family in the mid-Atlantic region. So he had some knowledge of that, and I remember him mentioning that when I was a teenager, and it interested me, but not until moving out to the Southwest in the late 1980s did I really, for the first time, hear stories about secret underground bases and installations, and that really caught my interest, the more so since the stories I heard alleged that there were not only clandestine government facilities, but that there were purported extraterrestrial beings working and living in these facilities along with clandestine government projects. So that was the first time I ran across that kind of information, and I've looked into it in some depth now. And you know what, George? I think there could just be a lot of truth to those stories.
I think so, too. Now, subsequently to some of your research, Richard, have you discovered that the underground bases are strictly government, or could they have been also UFO-type underground bases? Have you been able to convince yourself what they might be?
Yes, well, I think both and. And I would also say when you talk about the government that both civil government agencies and military government agencies would be present underground. It's not strictly a military presence, though there certainly are a good number of underground military facilities. And I've also been led to understand there are a good number of undersea military facilities. But in addition to civil and military government agencies, there are Fortune 500 companies, or rather Fortune 1000 companies. Some religious organizations have underground installations. The Mormons have a pretty good-sized one, sophisticated one outside of Salt Lake City in the Wasatch Mountains. The Scientologists have some underground facilities. Of course, the Vatican has a very well-known secret vaults beneath Vatican City in Rome, where a lot of information has been stored literally over a couple thousand years. And then there are other organizations such as multilateral institutions. NATO, for example, would have underground facilities. When you think about the facility in Norway, where a variety of agencies and governments have established a seed bank to preserve seed varieties from a very wide number of plants in the event of global catastrophe or cataclysm. The idea is that agriculture could be jump-started again using these seeds. And by the way, it's not the only facility where that is done. It just happens to be perhaps the most high-profile one.
And it's a pretty good idea, Richard, I think.
Well, yes, it is. In fact, if you look at the legends from peoples all over the planet, it's clear that there have been repeated episodic bouts of cataclysm on this planet at intervals of thousands of years, anywhere from 3 to 20,000 years, evidently. And anything from massive tsunamis to pole shifts, if you believe the work of Charles Hapgood, and I'm willing to attach some credence to his work. At times, evidently, the crust of the planet goes walkabout over the mantle and slips, sometimes maybe a couple of 3,000 miles at a time. And, of course, that will create quite a lot of upheaval, including climate change, which would certainly be disruptive to agriculture. So, from the standpoint of making sure that agriculture can continue, it is very wise to do that. And that's not the only facility like that. There are quite a number of them around the planet.
Which is probably smart, too, to keep them geographically scattered all over the place.
Yes. If I think you've had Cliff High on the program before.
Yeah.
He'll be on the program later this week. Of course, Cliff's internet webbot analyses indicate that we may have another such episode occurring in the near future. Of course, the future is plastic, and you never know what's going to happen unless and until it does. But for people who may have read some of his reports, there are some indications that may happen. You could ask him more about that. And certainly there have been other people speaking about that possibility as well. Cliff is not alone in that. In fact, a lot of people have been having dreams and visions in that vein, George, and including yours truly. So it does appear that it's a possibility, and that the human, quite a number of humans are picking up on it. It's as if it's out there in the stuff of the racial subconscious or unconscious, and we pick up on it in the dream or visionary state.
And I would guess if they're building seed banks for seeds, these tunnels must be for the folks they want to keep behind, huh?
Well, yeah, and see, that raises a real question. I'm inclined to believe, and I was asked this by another reviewer, this is what you're alluding to in a roundabout way, and that is, I believe that the people should be told, George, if there's going to be cataclysm upcoming, and the federal alphabet soup and other agencies around the world know that there is an excellent chance that this is going to happen. I really believe that people should be informed. I'm not an elitist at heart, and I'm wary of those who are. I believe that those who take lavish our money on themselves so that they can make extensive, expensive, and sophisticated preparations for their survival in the event that bad things happen to the planet, while making no provision for the survival of others and not even informing others of what is about to come down. In my view, that is not only unethical, it is borderline evil.
I agree with you, Richard. And, again, I reviewed the movie 2012 this weekend on DVD.
Yes.
And it's got that kind of theory to it, where
yes, it does.
They hid this for years from people. And
yes, it does. And, I mentioned at one point in my new book a conversation I had with one of the experts that I've consulted and interviewed and had lengthy discussions with over the past 17 years. And I asked this one expert about some of the reasons for creating underground bases of the clandestine variety. And, of course, I think many people are familiar with the idea that there are military command, control, and communication facilities such as Cheyenne Mountain and Site R on the East Coast. But there's so many more, you see, and many of them are very clandestine. Those are publicly known. There are many others that are not. So I was asking, about the reasons for these, and don't you know, some of the reasons that were given included such things as a pole shift, a change in the geophysics of the Earth's rotation, sudden climate change, that kind of thing. In other words, the so-called ruling elite, the technocratic elite, the extremely plugged-in insider engineers who work on these kinds of projects are well aware these types of events have come to pass in remote antiquity, and they're well aware that it's entirely possible these things will happen again. Moreover, George, it appears that they strongly believe that some of these things may be happening in the very near future, and they are making extensive, and I would underscore that, extensive, extremely expensive, and technologically very sophisticated preparations for these eventualities. And I believe that people should be told they're using our nickels to do it.
How many bases, Richard? How many?
Well, you see, that's an excellent question. And the answer is a little complex. I will preface my remarks by saying there are many of them. Let me give you, for example, and by many I mean minimally scores, and perhaps hundreds in this country alone. And this would be of the clandestine variety. And I list in my book, more than a score in the first part of the book of major underground facilities that are known to me through my research that I can just reel off the top of my head. But beyond that, there are certainly scores more. There was a book written by a man named Bill Gawley entitled Breaking Cover. Bill Gawley worked in the White House military office in the White House for years. I believe he began working there in the Eisenhower years and continued right up into the first part of the Carter presidency. So he saw quite a bit of what happened in the Oval Office, and he was heavily involved in it. Now, the military office is an office that liaises between the Pentagon and the executive office of the president, which is to say, the White House. And the military office essentially makes available to the president, any president, a slush fund of money that he can use at his discretion for projects that he deems important. This is essentially black budget activity. Now, what Bill Gawley says is that already starting back in the 1950s, in the Eisenhower years, the military office was heavily involved in building a suite, a whole series of 75 secure underground facilities for use of the president. And that was already in the 50s, you see.
Yeah.
So they started out with 75 secret underground facilities then, and that was more than half a century ago. And in the intervening years, my research shows quite clearly that far from building those and stopping, they have kept on ever since with a massive underground construction effort. So I would say, I'd be willing to say conservatively, 100 of the clandestine variety, and actually I'm inclined to believe there are far more than that. Now, one of my sources, when I asked him how many clandestine underground facilities are there, and he point blank told me there are many underground bases and thousands of people work in them. That's straight from the horse's mouth. Now, I went on to speak with him more, and one of the things he told me that fascinated me was that there are entire cutting-edge, really science fiction-like factories underground in some of these facilities. They're vast industrial production facilities that can essentially manufacture virtually anything from scratch. Say they needed to make a microwave oven. Everything exists underground in these facilities, and there are multiple such facilities in the United States alone, deeply buried. They're large and extremely high-tech. They would actually make the glass or they could make the glass that they needed for the little pane in the front of the microwave. They could. They have foundries down there where they could make the metal and roll out the aluminum. They could make the electronic and electrical components from scratch. They have all of the tools and machinery for that. If they needed to make an automobile, they could create an automobile from scratch, making the tires and everything, and so forth. This is virtually like something out of a science fiction movie, and yet there are multiple such facilities, and that's only what I was told about in a casual conversation over the telephone.
And I'm sure the Russians have them, like you said. The Vatican has one, maybe more. So it's all over the planet.
Well, yes, there are many all over the world. For example, in the run-up to the Gulf War, which George Bush conducted against the regime of Saddam Hussein, George Bush the father, George Bush père, the Bechtel Corporation, which is sometimes called part of the shadow government because it plays such a huge role in the working of the military-industrial espionage complex.
And they built half of Saudi Arabia, didn't they?
They did a lot, and all over the world. Bechtel has operations that are global in scope, but they're certainly very active in the United States as well. But they do quite a lot of work for the American government, and a lot of it is black budget type of operations. Well, they went into Saudi Arabia in the 1980s and built a series of 5 very deeply buried, very technologically sophisticated underground bases out in the desert in preparation for the Gulf War. People need to understand that wars don't just happen. They are arranged and planned many years in advance. Among other things, wars are big business for the Fortune 500 corporations. They make billions and even trillions of dollars off of warfare. And so for them, to lay the groundwork for a major war is a business undertaking. It's just business for them, the business of industrial slaughter, otherwise known as war. And they're very cynical and cold about it. Now, they will trot out propaganda for the public about liberty and freedom and democracy and so forth. The bottom line is war is big business, and that's what you need to understand first and foremost. And so Bechtel got huge contracts to go in and build those huge underground facilities in Saudi Arabia. I could document 5 from the open literature. And in fact, Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf, who was blustering all over TV and radio during the conduct of that war, did his fighting from deep underground. It's easy to be brave when you're a couple thousand feet underground, George.
Yeah, it is now. And I was going to ask you, how big and how deep? A couple thousand feet?
Oh, easily. I don't know exactly how deep those particular facilities are. I just know that they're deep. My guess would be at least several hundred feet, if not a couple thousand feet. Now, what I do know and have been told explicitly and have also documented from the literature that I've seen is that it's child's play to make a large base, 1 mile underground. That's state of the art and has been for decades, really.
That is just amazing. And I bet they go in almost with a slant type of drilling.
Well, there are different ways to do it. Yeah. You can go in, and I've seen schematic diagrams of various ways of doing it in the military and civil engineering literature and other government documents that I've looked at. You can access facilities by vertical shafts, and they can be quite deep. I mean, even in the open mining literature, they can make vertical shafts 2 miles deep, George.
Richard, they've got underground tunnels, for example, underwater, so they can do incredible things. Let's talk more about that, and maybe you can describe what they look like inside. More with Richard Sauder on Coast to Coast AM. You see, we're in our underground cavern, too. We'll be back with Richard Sauder in just a moment as we talk about hidden in plain sight Beyond the X-Files on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. We're with Richard Sauter tonight. Fascinating information. So, Richard, let's go back and talk about what they may look like, these facilities, and your thoughts again on how they construct them.
Well, what they look like depends on the function. Some of them can be quite large. I've been told that some of them are actually vast. And speaking with one specialist about the Monsanto complex in New Mexico, I asked about the dimensions of it, and the response was vast. I also was told about it by a woman who wrote to me and was a recipient of a deathbed confession from her elderly father, who had gone away from the family for some period of time when she was younger. All they knew was that he was working on a construction job in New Mexico, and not until he was about to die did he tell her that he had helped to build what he called an underground city, not a base, not a facility, but an actual city underground in New Mexico. And this was back in the 1950s. So they can be quite large. And actually some of the technology he described to her that they installed already back in the 1950s would be technology that even today many people would not have in their homes. So you have to understand that in the black world, there's technology that would be in these facilities that would be quite a lot different from what you would know from your everyday life. So not only can they be, the dimensions can be quite large inside, there can be cavernous chambers, but also the technology with which these things are equipped and outfitted is, really a technical quantum leap beyond what we have to use in our everyday lives. It's been held back from us, in other words. We're paying for it. It's being built with our money, but without our knowledge, and we don't have access to these things. We really have at least a two-tier society. We have what's going on in the black world, vastly funded, very technologically sophisticated, and then we have what's happening in our world, so to speak, which is much less well-funded and which is not nearly so technologically sophisticated. In fact, the infrastructure that we're dealing with is in a state of decline.
Yeah, I can believe that. And
well, I can see it. As you drive around and you look at what's happening, you can see crumbling bridges and streets, you see a rickety rail system, you see an electrical grid that is struggling to meet with supply-demand,
sure.
and on and on. Meanwhile, we have literally trillions of dollars being sucked out of the budget for stimulus bills, bailout bills. We had the spectacle of the Federal Reserve's chief financial officer testifying before Congress and being questioned by Representative Alan Grayson from Florida, and she had the cheek to tell him she could not account for the disposition of something on the order of $2 trillion, which ostensibly fall under her purview. So we're being mugged, George.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's not a small mugging. It's not like being held up at gunpoint and someone lists $100. We're being mugged by the trillions of dollars, and each individual is actually having thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars stolen from him and from her.
Now, beyond the bases for military purposes, to be able to control command and control, I can understand that. What are they using these facilities for? What are they expecting, Richard?
Well, you see, that's the question, and that's what really bothers me and other researchers too, the great secrecy that surrounds so much of this. One of the things we know, for example, the NSA has vast acres and acres and acres of supercomputers underground, which they use for surveillance purposes. Now, I mean Big Brother, George Orwell-style surveillance purposes. I object to that. I don't think that has any role in a free society. It does in dictatorship, but not in a free society. So that alone is an indication that we are now living under dictatorship, technocratic dictatorship. That's one example of some of the things that go on underground. Another example might be secretive biological engineering and genetic engineering. There are many, fair number of anecdotal accounts of this kind of thing happening underground, and that again is troubling, because if the human genome is being tinkered with, if there's secret human cloning research going on underground, if there is secret bacteriological warfare research going on underground, frankly, that's our business. It's our planet, and it's our welfare that is at stake and at question, and we absolutely deserve to know about it, the more so since we're paying for it. That's another example. Then there are many stories, of course, of underground facilities, and also some stories of undersea facilities with an alien presence. And by the way, the aliens need not always be non-human. Evidently, some of them are very human, and it would appear that one of the big secrets behind the ET and UFO cover-up is that, oh, by the way, not all of the ETs are non-human. Some of them are fully human, and it would appear that one of the big aspects of the cover-up is that the Earth may not be the only planet in the galaxy with a resident human population.
That's an incredible story.
Yes, and it's a story that I think a fair number of researchers are beginning to suspect is the truth. I'm one of them. Now, there are other things that have come my way. I've been told that some of these facilities can be secret mining facilities. Imagine if you have your own secret gold mine or uranium mine or platinum mine, and you are able to mine this and have your own stash of precious metals. That could be very valuable, especially if you are a government agency and you can move this on the black market to raise funding for other clandestine operations.
Sounds like somebody's being King Solomon all over again, huh?
Yeah, it could be. I'll give you one, for instance, of that I was related to me anecdotally, and that was during the construction of the facility, the so-called Monsanto underground base in New Mexico. I was told that, of course, there are veins of gold in the Rocky Mountains in general, and certainly in the mountains in New Mexico. And during the construction of this base, from time to time, the miners ran across veins of gold. In some cases, they were pretty good veins of gold. The ore was of a very high quality, and the generals that were running the project confiscated that gold for their own and self-enrichment. So that's one example. That was then a twofer. At one and the same time, they made a base that at that time was pretty secret. Not so much today, but at that time, yes. But in the process of building the base, they were also running their own clandestine gold mining operation.
Richard, do you think these mines, once they're built, are manned and there's a whole bunch of people down in each one of them? Or do they kind of leave until they have to go back down there and use it?
No. A lot of these would have a resident workforce, round the clock. Many of them are fully staffed all the time. It's hard to know just how many, because there's such a high degree of compartmentalization. The agencies involved, whether they're government organizations or non-governmental, are in the main very secretive. I would go further and say extremely secretive about what they're doing underground. There's another issue I want to mention, and that is, for years we've had a tremendous problem in the society of missing persons.
Yes.
A very large number of missing persons.
Thousands and thousands every year.
It's just a vast number.
Yeah.
And you can account for a certain number of them in terms of runaway children, husbands who are nagged one too many times and hit the road, etc. But beyond that, you're left with a large number of people that simply cannot be accounted for at the end of each year. Nationwide, it's quite large. I think it actually runs over 100,000 people a year who just fall through the cracks and vanish. Where do they go? What happens to them? I am beginning to wonder if some of them may not be taken underground as guinea pigs or forced labor, source of forced labor, or for other reasons. I think you've had Melinda Leslie on the program a time or two or more, and she certainly has talked to a number of people who've been abducted by the United States military. So there's a growing body of anecdotal evidence that points to the United States military running its own clandestine human abduction program for very obscure purposes. But part of this does entail taking people underground to these very bizarre underground facilities where the military is doing, frankly, weird things. And there are also, in some cases, aliens down there. Now, of course, we hear these stories from the ones who are abducted and come back, who live to tell the tale. What about the ones who may be abducted and don't return?
And there could be many of those too, then, Richard, as you were saying.
There could be many. And it appears that, in theory, the military is here to serve and defend, but in practice, researchers have found many, many disturbing military programs that, frankly, have preyed on have been predatory against the very population that they have sworn to keep safe and to defend from harm.
One would think that these bases, these tunnels, would be in areas of not too populated spots in this country, but a lot of them are under major cities, aren't they?
Well, that's right, and that's an important issue. I want to make clear for people that, in fact, there are a good number of bases in relatively unpopulated areas, in mountainous areas or desertous areas, and the technology exists to create vast underground and undersea bases literally anywhere on the planet and at great depth. However, as you observe, it's true that these facilities can be and are also located under major metropolitan areas, including cities such as Moscow, London, Beijing, New York, Washington, D.C., etc. And in some cases, the tunneling under these cities has been going on for millennia. In the case of Paris or Rome. Pardon me?
People hear hums, for example. Could that be the building of these bases?
I'll go you one better than that. I was recently speaking with a couple of naval intelligence officers, and they were telling me that during the Soviet period, when, as you know, there was a lot of surveillance of Soviet submarine maneuvers and vice versa on their part. But, of course, they were tasked with monitoring the maneuvers of Soviet submarines in the open sea. And they were constantly detecting drilling, large drills. And when they asked their superiors about that, they were told, oh, it's drilling. And when they asked what kind of drilling, they were given evasive answers, but were led to believe it was petroleum. And I pointed out to these guys that using the Navy's own documentation, going back to the mid-'60s already, and coming forward from that point, the United States Navy had an active R&D program for creating massive, permanently manned bases down in the bedrock beneath the seafloor in an open mid-ocean environment. I mean, hundreds of miles offshore, way offshore, and thousands of feet of water. So the technology that's described in the Navy documentation, which, by the way, is not classified, plainly states that technology from the offshore petroleum industry can be used in the construction of manned undersea bases in the deep sea environment. So I pointed this out to them and said, yeah, I don't doubt that you were here drilling. By the way, it could have been the United States Navy or aliens or the Russians or who knows, making undersea bases. And one of the ways they do that is by drilling through the bedrock down beneath the seafloor.
This is just remarkable. I'd like to go down to one of these one day, Richard.
Well, you may. I'll see if I can get us a pair of tickets, George.
Yeah. I'm not sure they'd let you go.
You bring the popcorn, and I'll finagle the tickets.
Absolutely. Now, we talked about how the seed bank is a good idea. We've talked about how, for some military purposes, it's probably a very smart idea to have these underground bases.
That's presuming that the military policy is sane. And I have to say, that more and more, I don't presume sanity on the part of military planners. And the old saw about military intelligence is that it's supposed to be a contradiction in terms.
But if for some reason this planet is going to get hit, let's say by an asteroid or some kind of missile attack, is it a smart idea to preserve a portion of humanity in these underground?
Yeah, it is. What I object to is the non-egalitarian manner in which it's being done. If, for example, NASA or other agencies know that the Earth is going to be shotgunned by asteroids, say 5 years from now, suppose the NSA with its Deep Space Sentry probes, which I've been led to understand are out in the vicinity of Pluto and Neptune, way out on the fringes of the solar system. Suppose they detect a huge number of asteroids inbound to the inner solar system and assign, the probability of the Earth getting shotgunned by space rock somewhere in the neighborhood of 99.9%. Mm-hmm. You see, I believe the human race should be told under those circumstances, and I believe there should effectively be a global lottery. And we would select those who would go underground into the Noah's Arks, rather than, say, the Council on Foreign Relations saying, oh, by the way, me and my wife and my children, we're going underground. And the rest of you suckers, good luck. I don't like that.
I agree with you, but, like 2012, what will probably happen is the wealthy will get the good seats.
Oftentimes that's the way it is. And I must say I'm not in agreement, and that would be one reason for the great secrecy in these facilities, because I've plainly been told that some of them are designed for that type of scenario, which means that at the highest levels, the so-called ruling elite are perfectly aware that is a possibility, maybe even a probability over the next 10 or 20 years.
All right, Richard, stay with us. We're already at the top of the hour, and we are talking with Richard Sauder, his remarkable new work, Hidden in Plain Sight, Beyond the X-Files, as we talk about these very secret underground tunnels and bases. Soon we'll go in underwater and find out what's there, too. I'm George Noory, back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And our guest tonight is Richard Sauder as we talk about his latest work, Hidden in Plain Sight, Beyond the X-Files. We'll be back with Richard in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Do you truly think, Richard, it's going to be around a 5-year period before we're going to be using these underground facilities?
I really don't know. I do know that the planet is in a period of transition. we've had some serious earthquakes already this year, and it looks like there may be some more. In fact, I don't know whether in the event of true cataclysm, say perhaps slippage of the crust on the mantle, whether it would matter if you were in an underground facility or not. I can see that under those conditions, there would be such chaos and cataclysm that it would be pretty much a crapshoot wherever you were as to whether you would survive physically.
It's got to be something they know is coming from above, because I agree with you. You know, if we had an earthquake like the one that hit near Chile, I mean, that would devastate, I think, any kind of underground cavern.
Well, it depends. If the facility is right on a fault, if it's bisected by a fault, yes. However, if it's not, then perhaps that would not be the case. I did see, when I was doing my research, some indications that a well-designed facility and a competent body of rock might actually fare better than a structure on the surface because of the way that seismic waves move through the rock. When they come to an empty place, they are greatly attenuated because they really can't be transmitted to any meaningful degree through the air, only through the rock. So when they get to the underground facility, because it's empty, it's an excavated space, the way the seismic waves don't really cause or have the same effect that they would on the surface necessarily. So it depends on how well designed and built the facility is. It also depends exactly where it's located, and I believe that the geological engineers who design and consult on the construction of these facilities would keep all of that in mind. So maybe in a well-designed and well-situated underground facility, you might actually fare as well or better than you would on the surface.
Do you think there would be planetary-wide panic if they said today, folks, a huge asteroid is coming to this planet, it will hit in the next 3 years, it can wipe out civilization the way we know it right now? What do you think would happen?
Oh, there'd be a lot of unrest. There'd be a lot of disquiet. There's no doubt. However, that would also be the case when and if it hits. So if the intent was to spare the public pain, I think the preferred course of action, were I in a position to influence public policy, would be to tell people in the best way possible. But yes, I would always be inclined to think that the public should be informed. It's our planet, and I think that we have a right to know what's happening on the planet.
Yeah, I think so too. Jim Marrs, you know Jim. He has written.
Yes, I know Jim.
He's written about our government now being the Fourth Reich. How does this fit into, if it does, these secret underground bases in this program?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that thesis of Jim's, and I have to say that I find some support for that line of thought in my own research. It's a fact that at the close of World War II, a very large number of Nazis were brought to this country to continue their work for the American regime, just as they had worked for the Nazi regime, with the difference that instead of saluting the swastika, they commenced saluting the Stars and Stripes. But they were carrying out the same work, the same research, developing the same technologies. Instead of working for the Nazi military, they worked for the American military. And in fact, when I went to the NASA archives, researching not underground bases, but something else entirely, I did run across a couple of Project Paperclip, declassified Project Paperclip memoranda, which I reproduce in my latest book. The thing I found interesting about those two particular memos was that they specifically requested 4 German technicians by name to come to the United States and to work on the American military's so-called underground plant program. This was circa 1947. One of the men whom was named was Xaver Dorsch. Now, he wasn't just any Joe Schmo who fell off a turnip truck. He was then perhaps the preeminent expert on underground construction, underground base construction. During the Third Reich, there was an agency called the Todt Organization, founded by a German engineer named Fritz Todt. And really, he was an engineering genius. He was the father of the German Autobahn system. When war broke out, or was instigated, as you like, Adolf Hitler asked Fritz Todt to create an organization, a civil engineering organization that would support the German military, which he did, and it was named after him, the Todt Organization. Fritz Todt was killed in a plane crash in 1942, and control of much of the organization's activities effectively passed to Xaver Dorsch, who was also quite a gifted civil engineer. Xaver Dorsch initially reported to Albert Speer, but as the war progressed, Hitler removed Dorsch from under Speer's command and had Xaver Dorsch report directly to him, Adolf Hitler. What Hitler wanted Dorsch to do was to create, in addition to the many other structures that the Todt Organization was building for the German military, was to create a series of deep underground industrial production plants, which Dorsch began to do, but of course the end of the war cut those plans short. He was taken into captivity by the American military and detained in one of their prisoner of war facilities. Now, while in American military captivity, he produced at least 2 documents during the course of his debriefing, which I have. There are others. There's at least one other I couldn't get, and I believe there must certainly be others that are classified to this day. Now, in this document that I have, the Project Paperclip memos, they ask specifically to bring Xaver Dorsch to the United States to work on the military's so-called underground plant program. I don't know if he came. I rather suspect he did, because most every German that Project Paperclip wanted, Project Paperclip got, and he was in American military custody. So I think it would have been pretty simple for them to bring him to the United States. He did have a civil engineering career in Germany after the war. However, he founded a firm in 1952, so there was a period of approximately 7 years where he would have been available to the Americans, and I rather suspect that he was consulting for them during that period.
Do you think any of these bases might be connected, Richard, in terms of tunnels with rail lines or anything like that?
Yeah, I do. I think that's very possible. In fact, there was another Nazi engineer. Well, I shouldn't say Nazi because I don't know if he was actually a card-carrying Nazi, but there was another German engineer who was working during the Third Reich by the name of Hermann Kemper, and he was working on a concept that he called the Rohrbahn. He carried out R&D on that during the 1930s and even during the 40s during World War II, and the research continued after World War II. And in fact, today the Germans are among the world leaders in magnetic levitation train technology, so-called maglev technology. And Hermann Kemper's Rohrbahn, even in the 1930s, was designed to go 1,800 miles per hour underground. That's 1,800 miles per hour underground, riding on a magnetic field and zooming through an underground tunnel from which most of the air has been evacuated, such that you have a partial vacuum. and thus you would have very little wind resistance and very little friction. And because the train would ride on a magnetic field, you wouldn't have friction from wheels and rails either. So it could indeed zip along very fast. So that was his scheme. That research has been continued down through the years. After World War II, in about 1949, Robert Goddard, the father of American rocketry, and really of chemical rocketry in general, who, by the way, did some of his best work in Roswell, New Mexico during the 1930s. Anyway, Goddard had a patent in 1949 in which he had a design similar in many respects to that of Hermann Kemper. But Robert Goddard's train was designed to go coast to coast in North America in 10 minutes. In other words,
10 minutes? Wow.
Yes, at about 15,000 miles per hour underground. Now that work was also extended by an engineer named Robert Salter for the Rand Corporation. He produced a study for the Rand Corporation in the 1970s with a scheme very similar to that of Hermann Kemper and Robert Goddard. In Salter's scheme, you would have, again, a maglev train, very high-speed maglev train, going at speeds in the 14,000 and 15,000 mile per hour range. However, Salter, in Salter's scheme, there's provision made for intermediate stops mid-continent, so he would take as much as, say, 50 or 55 minutes to go coast to coast.
That's going to happen if it isn't
well, you
really
see,
going
it may already have been done.
Yeah.
And I say that because starting about in the mid-'60s and continuing through the '70s and right down to the late '70s and maybe around 1980 or so, there was in this country something called the High Speed Ground Transportation Initiative. This was a multi-agency R&D effort involving some military agencies from the Navy and Army, for example, but also from other government agencies such as the Department of Transportation. And then you had some of the railroads involved. Major corporations like GE and Westinghouse, I believe, were involved. Then you also had some of the nation's premier engineering schools, mining engineering and also other engineering schools who were involved in the design, R&D of an underground, very high-speed tube train tunnel network. Now, this research was carried out actively over a period of years, and this multi-agency, approximately 15-year effort produced a pile of studies, articles, designs, memos, etc., many of which I have collected in the course of my research. And it all went away in about the early 1980s, late 70s, early 1980s. Not too long after that, we started hearing rumors about secret underground tunnel systems with high-speed trains zooming through them.
And we started hearing hums around this country.
Yeah, all of which causes me to think that there probably are secret underground high-speed trains. There's certainly people who say that there are. I'm inclined to give them a hearing.
Let's talk for a moment, Richard, if we can, about some of the undersea bases, and then at the break we'll get into what could be extraterrestrial or alien bases and see if there's a working relationship here. Now, these undersea bases fascinate me. Are these bases that you have to get to them via submarine, or is there another way to enter and get into them?
Well, my research shows that there would be at least 3 ways, and maybe more if there were exotic technologies involved. One of the most prosaic ways to enter an undersea base would be via a vertical shaft on an island, say like Bermuda or the Hawaiian Islands or something like that. and go down, say, a mile or two or three through a vertical shaft, and once at depth, go out under the sea through a more or less horizontal tunnel and access undersea bases that way. In theory and in practice, there's nothing to exclude such tunnels for extending for hundreds of miles, the more so if you have high-speed trains zooming through them. So that's one way. Another way is to actually extend tunnels out under the seabed from onshore. And again, here, the tunnels could even be hundreds of miles long. There's another way to do it, and that is to put airlocks right on the seafloor and to get access to an undersea base that way. All of these means of accessing undersea bases are openly discussed in the open literature that I've examined. Now, if you did have submarine access, it's state-of-the-art for the United States Navy, and I'm sure for other navies as well, to mate to hatches for airlocks in a deep-sea environment. So that certainly would be a way to transfer not only personnel, but supplies and equipment. I believe that's happening. The circumstantial evidence I have points in that direction, and I've had people tell me that there are undersea facilities. So at this point, I accept that they must exist.
Did you come across any research that shows that some of these undersea bases are either at the North Pole or the South Pole?
Yeah, and if you look at the illustrations in my book, there's some wonderful illustrations by a Navy illustrator who was attached to the Navy's R&D team at the China Lake Naval Ordnance Test Station in California back in the mid-1960s. His name is Walter Kirshner, and he in fact produced one illustration that depicts a submarine going through a subsea tunnel through a kind of a seamount, and that is clearly in a polar region because there's pack ice there on the surface of the sea. So clearly the Navy had asked him or tasked him with depicting graphically certain scenarios related to undersea submarine tunnels as well as undersea bases. So, yeah, I think they're there, and other places around the world as well, George. The picture that's come into focus for me is that we have been so massively lied to that we, the members of the public, don't really understand the full extent of the technology that's been developed with our money, without our knowledge.
Right.
And to our great detriment, we are fighting ruinous wars right now over fossil fuel reserves in Asia. Meanwhile, technology is being held back from us that makes all of that superfluous. So the reason this is happening is just for war profiteering. End of discussion.
Did the Nazis, after the war, besides coming here under the paperclip operation and what they may be doing, I had always heard that Hitler escaped in a submarine and made his way under the Antarctica.
Yeah, I don't know if Hitler escaped or not. He may have. I couldn't say one way or the other. But it is true the Nazis had an interest in the Antarctic, and in fact they claimed part of the Antarctic territory for the Third Reich. So I wouldn't rule out that the Nazis may have had some kind of activities at the South Pole.
Richard, stay with us. We're going to come back and talk about what the ETs might have. We'll be back. Okay, next hour we'll open up the phone lines, give you an opportunity to talk with Richard Sauter about his really remarkable work with Hidden in Plain Sight Beyond the X-Files. We'll be back with him, though. I want to talk about the possibility of these ET underground bases. That's next on Coast to Coast AM. Richard, what did your work uncover? I was going to say dig up, but as we talk about underground bases, maybe we shouldn't. What did your work uncover about ETs and the possibility of their bases?
Well, they certainly seem to be down there. There are a fair number of people who report being taken